Hey guys, tonight we're asking a question that sounds a little absurd at first, which is whether people in the Middle Ages might have carried less worry through their days than we carry through ours. If these long, slow wanders through the past are something you look forward to, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps the channel keep going, though only if you truly enjoy what happens here. And if you feel like leaving a comment, tell me where in the world you are and what the clock says on your side of it. I love reading those. There is something quietly lovely about knowing that the same story is unfolding in 100 different time zones at once. So, let us go back about 800 years to a small village in the English countryside somewhere in the middle of the 13th century. It is still dark. The air inside the cottage smells of wood smoke and damp thatch and the faint sourness of yesterday's ale. Somewhere out in the blackness the church bell begins to ring, slow and unhurried, the way bells were rung before anyone thought to be in a hurry. A rooster answers it, shouting at nothing in particular, as roosters have always done. And before the villager has even opened her eyes, she already knows almost everything about the day ahead of her. She knows what she will eat. She knows where she will walk. She knows who she will see and roughly what they will say. And she knows with weary certainty that her neighbour's cow will find its way into the wrong field again, for what feels like the 40th time this year. Breakfast, if she takes one at all, is a piece of coarse dark bread and a little weak ale, eaten standing up. Then the door opens onto grey light and wet grass, and she walks out along a track she has known since she was small enough to be carried down it, towards fields she could describe with her eyes closed. The long strips of ploughland, the boundary stones, the crooked hawthorn that everybody uses as a landmark and nobody remembers planting. The same soil, the same neighbours, bent over the same rows, the same hedgerow with the same blackbird complaining from it. Exciting? Not especially. Predictable? Utterly. And it is precisely there, inside that flatness, that something rather interesting begins to happen. Think for a moment about how many decisions a modern morning asks for before a person has properly woken up. What to wear, out of a wardrobe that could clothe several people. What to eat, from a kitchen holding food grown on 3 continents. Which messages to answer first. Which of the small glowing rectangles wants attention most urgently. Even something as ordinary as buying toothpaste seems to require comparing 20 different tubes, each promising a revolutionary mineral discovered by an unusually enthusiastic dentist. Our village's great shopping dilemma, meanwhile, was whether the baker still had bread. If he did, the matter was settled. If he did not, she went home and ate what was already in the house, which was likely to be pottage, and would very probably be pottage again tomorrow. Her world was astonishingly small, and that smallness shaped everything. The village was, as far as her daily life was concerned, the centre of existence. Past the surrounding woods lay 2 or 3 other settlements, much like her own. A day's walk away, perhaps, there was a market town with a proper church tower and a fair once a year, which was an event worth talking about for months afterwards. And beyond that, somewhere far off in a direction she could point to only vaguely, there was London. She had heard things about it. She had never seen it, and in all likelihood never would. Most people in medieval Europe lived and died within a few miles of the place they were born. There were exceptions, naturally. Soldiers marched, merchants travelled. Pilgrims set out for shrines near and far, sometimes walking for months to stand for a few minutes in front of something holy. A person could always be summoned away on the Lord's business, which was rarely good news. But for the great majority there was simply no reason to leave, and a great many practical reasons to stay. At first that sounds terribly narrow, and in some ways it was. But consider what came with it. She was not measuring her life against thousands of strangers she would never meet. She did not lie awake wondering why a blacksmith somewhere in France had bought his third horse while she was still negotiating daily with a mule of famously firm opinions. She never scrolled past pictures of other people's holidays and felt the ground tilt very slightly beneath her. She had no earthly idea what anyone in Tuscany was doing, and Tuscany for its part had no idea about her. Her comparisons stayed local, and being local, they made sense. She knew the baker and the miller and the carpenter. She knew the priest and the family whose pigs had escaped 3 times already that month. When the blacksmith built himself a larger house, nobody stood in the lane resenting it, because everybody had watched him earn it, forge fire by forge fire, over the better part of 20 years. The village agreed that he deserved it, and that agreement was worth something. Success, you can see the whole shape of, is a much easier thing to be glad about. There is a thought worth resting on here. For nearly all of human history, people lived among perhaps 100 or 200 faces. Those were the faces the mind learned to recognize, to trust, to quietly gossip about, to argue with, and then to see again at church the following Sunday, while both parties pretended that nothing whatsoever had happened. Now a single ordinary day can carry 1,000 faces past us. News. Advertisements. Strangers on screens. Celebrated people who apparently rise at 4 in the morning to drink something green on a mountainside before attending to their correspondence, while the rest of us are simply trying to remember why we walked into the kitchen. It is not a failing in anyone. It is only that we were never built for a crowd quite that large. Now, I want to be careful here, because it would be very easy to turn all of this into a golden age, and it was nothing of the kind. Medieval villagers worried, constantly and legitimately. They worried about the harvest which a single bad week of weather could ruin. They worried about illness moving through a household. They worried about their children, many of whom did not live to grow up, a sorrow that touched nearly every family and was carried with a quiet endurance we can only guess at. They worried about the tax collector, about the Lord's demands, about a winter that began early and stayed late. Life could be desperately hard, and no amount of gentle nostalgia should be allowed to soften that. But notice the shape of those worries. Almost all of them were immediate, visible, and physical. They stood in the field or the doorway where they could be looked at directly, and very often something could be done about them, even if that something was only work. Nobody lay awake because of an argument between strangers on the far side of the world, or a market falling in a country they had never heard of, or a message marked urgent that arrived at 20 to 10 on a Friday night. Their mental world was about the same size as their physical one, and there was a kind of rest in that. Not comfort exactly, and certainly not ease, but a mind that was allowed to stop scanning the horizon for the next thing to be uneasy about. If a medieval villager wanted to know what tomorrow would ask of her, she needed no calendar, no wristwatch, and no 3 polite notifications informing her that she was already behind. She looked out of the door. If it was spring, she planted. If it was summer, she weeded and watered and watched and hoped for the right amount of rain. If it was autumn, she harvested, and everybody harvested, because the whole village raced the weather together. If it was winter, she mended tools and clothes, spun wool, hauled firewood, and tried not to complain too loudly about how cold her feet had become. Every season arrived with its instructions already attached, and that mattered rather more than we might assume. A day whose shape is decided in advance asks far less of a person than a day that must be invented out of nothing. Medieval people did not discover this idea. They simply lived inside it, because there was no other way for the work to get done. The sun decided when the day began. The bell marked its important moments: morning prayer, midday, evening. The turning of the year decided what mattered most this week. Nature, rather than an inbox, was the manager. And scattered through that year were the feast days of the church, which were rest as much as they were devotion, days when the fields were left alone, the village ate together, and the ordinary rules of the week were gently set aside. So she did not wake up asking whether this might be the ideal morning to reinvent her working life. She already had one, and it needed her. She did not spend 3/4 of an hour deciding whether to answer letters before breakfast or after. She was far more likely to spend 3/4 of an hour explaining to a donkey that a shallow stream was not, in fact, the greatest peril ever faced by a living creature. The whole village moved almost like one slow animal. At dawn, everybody became busy at roughly the same time. In the evening, everything wound down together. Smoke rose from the roofs, families drew indoors, candles and rushlights were used sparingly because tallow and wax cost money, and darkness itself made the sensible suggestion that work was over now. When the sun went down, nobody could reach you. Granted, the person you answered to might be a lord rather than a regional manager, which brought its own considerable disadvantages, but at least he could not call a meeting after supper. Routine also quietly removed 100 small decisions. Clothing, for most people, meant working clothes and better clothes. The second kept for church, weddings, feast days and funerals. That was very nearly the entire wardrobe question, settled for life. Nobody stood before a mirror murmuring that they had nothing to wear while surrounded by enough cloth to dress half the parish. Meals followed the same pattern. Something modest in the morning, if anything at all. The main meal in the middle of the day when the body most needed it. Supper before the light failed. Food arrived when the year allowed it. New greens in spring, fruit in late summer, salted and stored provisions through the cold months, rather than because strawberries had flown across the planet in January. There was a plainness to it, and inside the plainness, a kind of steadiness. None of this erased hardship. Harvest could leave a person too tired to speak. Winter could feel endless. A single storm could flatten months of patient work in an afternoon. But even those disasters fitted into a cycle that generations had already lived through. She was not facing a brand new kind of problem every week. She inherited rhythms her parents and grandparents had understood, and with the rhythms came the knowledge of when to sow, when to reap, when to celebrate, and when to simply endure until the season turned. Life still surprised her. Today, a person is expected to find their passion, build a living around it, hold work and rest in careful balance, cultivate several interesting hobbies, stay fit, learn a language, plan for old age, see the world, and become the finest possible version of themselves, ideally before some arbitrary. It merely surprised her considerably less often than a modern morning does before the first cup of tea has had time to cool. And there is one more question, perhaps the heaviest one we carry, that she almost never had to ask herself. Am I doing enough with my life? Birthday. In the Middle Ages, the instructions were considerably shorter. If your father farmed, there was an excellent chance you would farm. If your mother spun wool, brewed ale or baked, you learned those things from the moment your hands were big enough. If the family was tied to the mill, you knew where you would be standing long before your 10th birthday. The future was not hidden behind an infinity of possible doors. It was standing out in the yard, waiting. That was restrictive, and it is only right to say so plainly. Movement between stations did happen. A gifted apprentice could rise to become a respected master. A clever boy might enter the church and be taught to read Latin. A fortunate merchant could grow genuinely wealthy. But it was uncommon, and a great many people lived their whole lives inside the circumstances they were born into, however much they might have wished otherwise. That is a real loss, and no arrangement of pretty sentences can balance it out. Still, fewer doors meant fewer crises of identity. She did not spend years wondering whether farming truly expressed her authentic self. She was too busy keeping the chickens out of next year's seed. Nobody asked her to describe her values or to explain where she saw herself in 5 years. Had anyone asked, the honest answer might well have been, still alive, ideally with both cows, which was considered ambitious, but reasonable. Her sense of who she was came from relationships rather than achievements. She was someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's neighbor, someone's godmother. Everyone knew her family, her reputation, and her place in the pattern. That could press in on a person, certainly. It could also hold them up. She belonged somewhere, and nobody required her to become a different person every few years in order to remain interesting. The medieval world tended to prize consistency far above novelty. Being dependable earned more respect than being remarkable. A carpenter whose joints held, a baker who did not cheat the weight, a shepherd who knew every animal on the hill. These were the people who mattered enormously to a village, far more than anyone forever chasing the next opportunity. And when a bad day came, the whole village generally knew about it by sunset. To modern ears, that sounds like a nightmare. At the time, it was closer to a safety net. Villages were small, some only a few dozen households, larger ones a couple of 100 souls, and the same faces appeared every single day. The baker was not a stranger behind a counter. The priest had very likely baptized you, your parents, and half your cousins. Everybody knew everybody's business, and privacy was, let us say, in short supply. If you argued at home, your neighbour heard it. If your goat ate somebody's cabbages, the news travelled faster than the goat. If you slipped into a muddy ditch on the way home from the alehouse, congratulations, you were next week's entertainment. Embarrassing, often. Lonely, rarely. Because when real trouble arrived, the village stepped in, since survival simply depended on it. If a roof caught fire, neighbours formed lines with buckets. If a family fell ill at harvest, others brought in their grain alongside their own. When someone died, the village gathered for the burial and then went on quietly gathering afterwards, making sure the household left behind was fed. Some accounts suggest that in many places this was not merely goodwill, but something closer to an understood obligation, a thing you did because one day it would be done for you. That help was kindness, certainly, and it was also insurance. This week you mended a neighbour's fence. Human beings spent most of their long history in small groups, in bands and hamlets and clusters of related families, and only very recently in buildings where a person might live beside the same neighbour for 5 years and know almost nothing about them beyond the hour they tend to run thee. Next winter he hauled your cart out of the mud. On the afternoon your horse forgot, quite suddenly, how legs were supposed to work. There is another thread running quietly through all of this, softer than the rest, and it has to do with company. Washing machine. A medieval villager could not disappear in that way, even on the days they might have liked to. Every lane through the village passed somebody's doorway. Every errand crossed a field where somebody was already working. The people gathered at the well had known a person since the day they were born, had watched them learn to walk, and held firm opinions about the man or woman they had married. If someone kept to themselves for a week, it was noticed. A neighbour would appear at the door, ask why they had not been seen at church, and stand there quite comfortably, waiting for an answer. It would be a mistake to paint that as unbroken warmth. Village life had a generous share of friction. People quarrelled over boundary stones and grazing rights, over inheritances and dowries, over which family owed what to the lord, and over whose pigs had once again found their way into a neighbour's cabbages. Manor Court records survive in surprising numbers, and they are full of small, entirely human disputes. A hedge shifted a few feet in the wrong direction, a debt of a few pence, a sheep that wandered off one afternoon and never came back. Grudges could settle in and last for decades, handed down from parents to children like a piece of furniture. Gossip travelled fast and lingered long, and there was no stepping out of the conversation, no distance to retreat into, no way to simply stop hearing about it. To fall out with someone was to keep meeting them anyway, at the mill, at the harvest, and at every wedding and funeral for the rest of a lifetime. And yet underneath all that friction sat something that is difficult to buy and difficult to build. People belonged. Whether or not they liked everyone around them, they were woven into the fabric of the place. When a cottage roof needed rethatching, hands appeared. When a family lost a father before the harvest was in, the neighbours brought that harvest in, not out of charity exactly, but because next year the need might run the other way. Ploughs and oxen were often shared between households, since a single family could rarely afford a full team. In many villages the bread oven was communal, and the well, and the pasture. Dependence ran in every direction at once. It could be constraining, and often was, but it also meant that when life turned difficult, most people could reasonably expect not to face it entirely alone. Then there was the shape of the day itself. Imagine the close of an ordinary working day in late summer. The back aches. The boots are heavy with dried mud. There has been a long disagreement with an opinionated sheep who remains convinced that the vegetable garden was planted for his personal benefit. The sun begins to lower toward the tree line, and something quietly remarkable happens. The day's work ends. Not because every task has been finished, since there were always more weeds, more fences leaning where they ought to have stood straight, more tools waiting to be sharpened. It ends because the light has decided. Once darkness settled, most work became genuinely impractical, and candles and rushlights were too costly and too dim to spend on jobs that could wait until morning. Daylight was the clock, and nobody argued with it. The contrast with our own arrangement is hard to miss, though it is worth being fair about it. The modern day rarely closes so cleanly. A phone hums during dinner. A laptop keeps its place at the end of the kitchen table like a member of the household. There is always one more message to answer, one more thing to tidy before tomorrow, and the boundary between working and resting has worn thin enough to see through. A ploughman in Norfolk in the year 1340 had a great many problems, but that particular one was not among them. No messenger arrived after sunset with a quick question, and 6 further tasks trailing behind it. Nothing followed him home, because home was where the light ended. So the village changed gear together as the sun went down. Animals were fed and shut in, tools were wiped and set against the wall. Smoke thickened above the thatch as fires were built up, and the evening meal was set over them, most often pottage, that endlessly adaptable pot of grains and vegetables and whatever else the season had offered, alongside dark bread and perhaps a little cheese. Families gathered close to the hearth because that was where the warmth and the light were, which meant everyone ended up in the same room whether they had intended to or not. Children heard stories they had already heard dozens of times and listened anyway. Adults mended clothes, carved handles, spun wool by feel more than by sight, and talked. Conversation had no competition. When someone told the tale of the unusually determined goose that had chased the blacksmith across the green that morning, they had the room's full attention. And if they were interrupted, they were at least interrupted by a person who was actually there. Sleep, too, followed the light rather than a schedule. With no reliable way to hold back the dark, most people grew tired not long after it arrived. Some accounts suggest that medieval Europeans commonly slept in two stretches, a first sleep and a second sleep, with a quiet waking hour between them, spent talking, praying, tending the fire, or simply lying still in the dark. Historians continue to debate how widespread that pattern truly was, and it may well have varied a great deal by season and by place. What is less disputed is the broader point. The rhythm of rest was set by the sun rather than by anything human. Light in the morning, darkness at night, and a body with no particular reason to disagree with either. None of which is to pretend that medieval evenings were always peaceful. A storm rolling in during the wrong week could threaten a whole year's food. A child with a fever could keep an entire household awake and worried. Winter nights were long and cold and cheap to worry through. Hunger and illness were real and near, and no amount of gentle candlelight softens that. Yet there was still one genuine difference worth naming. Rest was not something anyone had to arrange or defend or feel faintly guilty about. It arrived every evening on its own, unasked for, and it made the same quiet argument to everyone in the village at once, which was that tomorrow's work belongs to tomorrow. Something similar happened with choices, or rather with the absence of them. Had a traveller wandered into a peasant's cottage and asked what the options were for the day, the answer would have been wonderfully brief. There is what is in the pot. There is what is hanging on that peg. There is the work that needs doing. That is more or less the whole of the list. Modern life is built on something closer to the opposite principle. We are taught, reasonably enough, that more options mean more freedom, and often they genuinely do. But some researchers have noticed a curious effect running the other way. Past a certain point, additional choices seem to stop feeling like liberty and begin to feel like labor. The mind has to compare and rank, and then live with a faint suspicion that a better option was passed over somewhere in the pile. Half an hour spent deciding which film to watch, ending with no film at all, is a very peculiar sort of difficulty, and one that would have thoroughly puzzled a 14th century farmer. Consider clothing. Most ordinary medieval people owned very few garments. A linen shirt or shift worn next to the skin, woolen outer clothes for daily work, a cloak against cold and rain, sturdy shoes repaired far more often than they were replaced, and, if the household could manage it, one better set kept aside for church, for weddings, and for the great feast days. Clothes were mended, turned, handed down, and eventually cut into something else altogether. Nobody stood before a chest sighing that there was nothing to wear because the answer was hanging in plain sight. Fashion did exist, and it mattered enormously at the top of society, where nobles and wealthy merchants delighted in fine wool and imported silk, in bright dyes that cost a fortune to fix, in sleeves and hems that announced a family's standing from clear across a hall. Laws were even passed in several kingdoms attempting to restrict who could wear what, which suggests how seriously it was all taken. But for the great majority of people, practicality won every argument, and it won without a fight. Food worked much the same way. There was no deliberating between one cuisine and another. Dinner depended almost entirely on the season and on what the land had produced. Vegetables appeared when they were ready and vanished when they were done. Bread came from whatever grain grew locally, which meant rye in some regions, barley in others, and wheat mostly for those who could afford it. Cheese and butter came from the animals in the village. Meat was, for many families, an occasional pleasure attached to a feast day rather than a daily expectation. And even then it was often salted or smoked rather than fresh. Ali was drunk in quantity, since it was brewed at home and kept better than water. The menu, if it can be called a menu, was written by the weather. Work followed a similar pattern. Most children learned the trade of their parents, or entered an apprenticeship arranged through a relative or a family friend, and the matter was largely settled before they were old enough to hold an opinion about it. A cooper's son learned to raise a barrel. A weaver's daughter learned to spin long before she learned to read, if she ever learned to read at all. There was no long stretch of years spent wondering whether smithing might suit better than carpentry, while quietly dreaming of something else altogether. It would be dishonest to make that sound like a gift. Very often it was a wall. Fewer choices also meant doors that stayed closed no matter how hard someone knocked. A farmer with a real gift for numbers or for languages might live his whole life without ever being taught to read. A girl with a genuine talent for healing might spend it entirely within her own household, since the schools of medicine were closed to her by law and by custom alike. Some did find a way through by way of the church, or a monastery school, or a guild that took an interest in a promising apprentice. But they were the exceptions, and they knew it. That narrowness was a real loss, borne by real people across whole lifetimes, and no amount of fondness for simplicity should be allowed to paper over it. Still, for the smaller sort of decisions, the ones that fill a modern day the way sand fills a jar, medieval life offered a kind of relief. There was far less to research, far less to compare, and nobody at all trying to persuade a household that its bucket was out of date. The old bucket carried water. That was the whole of the bucket's job, and it was doing it. Medieval people owned a tiny fraction of what we own, and they also spent a tiny fraction of the time we spend wondering whether they ought to own something different. Their attention went into living, rather than into adjusting the terms of living. There was one more source of steadiness, and it may have been the deepest of them all. When crops began to fail, when the weather turned strange for weeks together, when a child fell ill and nobody could say why, there was no way to go looking for an explanation. What people had instead was faith. Across Christian Europe, and in the Muslim and Jewish communities that neighboured and overlapped with it, religion was not something set aside for one morning of the week. It was the frame around everything: harvests good and poor, storms, recovery, birth, and the turning of the year. Life did not always make sense, but it always carried meaning, and that distinction matters more than it might sound. Hardship has generally been easier to carry when it seems to belong to some larger pattern than when it seems to have arrived out of nowhere, and for a medieval villager the unexplained usually had somewhere to go. Whether those explanations answered the question in any final sense is not the point here. They gave the mind a place to rest. And the faith of the age filled the calendar besides, with bells that divided the day into named hours, feasts that divided the year into seasons of fasting and celebration, and a gathering each week where the whole community stood together in a single room. That same narrowness shaped how people measured themselves. In most medieval communities, a person's place in the world was largely settled long before they were old enough to worry about it. Born into a farming family, a child farmed. Born to a carpenter, that child was likely to spend their early years learning the grain of timber. Born into a noble household, the duties looked entirely different, but they were drawn just as firmly and could feel just as inescapable. There was no long ladder standing in the middle of the room, waiting to be climbed. There was simply the life in front of them. That was unfair, plainly. A labourer could not decide one morning to become a merchant of substance. A poor family could rarely send even one child to a university, let alone several. Society drew its lines early and kept them where they were, and those lines were felt keenly by the people living inside them. But it did carry one unexpected consequence. Far less time was spent measuring one life against another. Comparison for us has become something close to a daily occupation. Someone of the same age has built a company. Someone else has run a marathon, restored a house, taken up bread making, and photographed all of it before breakfast. The mind keeps a running tally almost without being asked. A medieval villager compared themselves too, of course, because people always have, but the scoreboard was very small and very local. There was the blacksmith, the miller, the priest, and the family with the best land at the top of the lane. And crucially, those lives were seen whole rather than in fragments. Everyone knew the blacksmith had hurt his shoulder the previous winter and had not been quite the same since. Everyone knew the miller's roof let in the rain. Everyone knew the prosperous farmer had 6 children who ate everything the moment it appeared. The full picture was always in view, and the full picture tends to keep comparison honest. There was another difference too, and it may be the most important of all. Success was not defined as continual growth. If a household had enough food to reach the spring, a roof that held, animals that stayed healthy, and a good name among the neighbours, most people would have counted that as a life going well. The aim was not to have more each year than the year before. The aim was steadiness, to get through, to provide, and, if it could be managed, to hand on to the children something a little more secure than what had been inherited. That kind of ambition had an ending built into it, a point at which enough was genuinely enough. Ours, very often, does not. In our own age there is nearly always one more thing waiting a little further ahead. Another post to be promoted into, another qualification to gather, another sensible investment, another milestone that seems to hold happiness inside it, the way a purse holds a coin. It is a little like walking toward the horizon. However far a person travels, the line stays exactly where it was, patient and unbothered, always the same distance away. Medieval people wanted better lives too, of course. They wanted a fuller barn, a healthier flock, a roof that turned the rain, a daughter married into a household that would treat her kindly. But alongside that wanting sat something our own century often finds difficult to say aloud, which is that not everybody needed to become extraordinary. To be known as an honest neighbour, a steady worker, a craftsman whose joints held and whose seams did not fail, someone who appeared at the door when a barn burned or a child was unwell, carried real and lasting respect. Admiration from thousands of strangers was not required. What mattered was being trusted by the 40 or 50 people whose faces a person would see every day of their life. There is a quiet irony in that. Medieval society offered far fewer paths through life, and the ones it offered were often narrow and difficult to leave. Yet in closing so many doors, it also spared a great many people the particular weariness of feeling they ought to be forever turning into somebody else. Simply being enough, and knowing it, is a rare and gentle sort of luxury. And so, at the end of a long day of work, a villager faced a decision of a very modest kind. Whether to go and hear the travelling storyteller who had arrived that afternoon and was already installed beside the alehouse fire. Whether to play a game of tables with a neighbour on a board worn smooth by other people's hands. whether to listen to the two men who could coax a tune out of a pipe and a fiddle, or whether simply to sit near the hearth while a grandfather told, once again, the story of the enormous fish that had very nearly been caught some 30 winters ago. The fish, everyone agreed, had grown considerably over the years. Nobody minded. That was rather the point. Entertainment in the Middle Ages was not endless, and that was precisely what made it feel like a gift. Today, a screen in the corner of a room holds thousands of films, and a device the size of a hand holds more to watch than anyone could finish in several lifetimes. Music never has to stop. News arrives in small, insistent pieces all day long, and every application is quietly hoping that 5 more minutes will not hurt. And then, somehow, it is 1 in the morning, and someone who intended an early night has become deeply invested in a stranger rebuilding a dry stone wall in a valley they will never visit. A medieval villager could not take in the world at that speed even if they had wished to. When the day's work ended, entertainment required people. Somebody had to tell the story, somebody had to play, somebody had to sing, and somebody had to be willing to be the first to dance, which is often the hardest part of all. And if nobody felt like doing any of those things, then everybody talked. Conversation was the evening's entertainment. People shared local news, family history, old legends, jokes that had been improved over decades, and a generous quantity of gossip. Had those villages somehow been offered reality television, it is hard to imagine anyone watching. They already had old Thomas explaining, with the gravity of a man delivering a royal proclamation, exactly why the baker's daughter had been seen speaking with the cooper's son beside the churchyard wall for the better part of a quarter of an hour. Storytelling held a special place in all of this. Long before printed books were ordinary things, history and folklore and heroic tales and the lives of the saints travelled from person to person, carried in memory rather than on paper. Children learned them by listening from the edge of a room where they were supposed to be asleep. Adults kept them alive by telling them again, each teller shifting a word here and a detail there, so that a tale might arrive in one village a little different from how it had left the last. A skilled teller could hold a whole room still for hours with nothing but a good voice and a sense of when to pause. The imagination of the listener did most of the work, painting the forest, the sea, the enemy at the gate. Some who study attention suggest there is something worth noticing in that. When a story arrives without pictures attached, the mind supplies them, which makes a listener a kind of quiet participant rather than an observer. A great deal of modern entertainment asks nothing of us except that we keep looking. The screen does the imagining on our behalf. Games were social in much the same way. People played board games and games of dice, chess among those with the leisure and the pieces to play it, and countless local games whose rules changed from one valley to the next and were defended fiercely by whoever had grown up with them. The young wrestled, raced one another across stubble fields, practiced at the archery butts on a Sunday afternoon, and knocked a stuffed ball about in whatever open ground the village had. Nobody counted their steps. Nobody thought of movement as a category separate from living. People moved because standing still all day would have struck everyone as very strange indeed. Perhaps the greatest difference of all was that these amusements had endings. When the storyteller reached his last line, he stopped. When the musicians rapped their instruments and pushed back the bench, the evening began, gently, to conclude. There was no unseen mechanism murmuring that, since you enjoyed that, here are 347 further stories you simply must hear before sunrise. Instead, the dark drew in around the houses. The fire sank to embers, and someone banked it for the morning. people wished one another good night in the doorway, and a mind that had enjoyed quite enough excitement for one day was finally permitted to become wonderfully, peacefully unoccupied. Those who think about such things now tend to say that having nothing much to do is not a fault to be corrected, but a kind of resting place. Medieval people did not arrange retreats or quiet weekends away. Their world simply left their attention a great deal of room in which to breathe. By now, medieval life may be starting to sound rather appealing. A slower pace, neighbours who knew one another, a routine that repeated itself like a familiar tune, and absolutely no message arriving at 11:30 at night to ask whether there has been a chance to look at this yet. It is tempting to picture a small cottage with a warm hearth and a loaf just out of the oven. And then reality knocks politely at the door and lets itself in. Because while medieval people may have carried less of the constant low hum of modern worry, they carried a different weight altogether. Theirs was immediate. It could not be postponed, negotiated, or answered later in the week. If the harvest failed, no food could be summoned from elsewhere. If a beam gave way under the snow in February, nobody was coming between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening to see about it. If a horse went lame halfway to market, the day that had been so carefully planned had just become tomorrow's problem, assuming tomorrow was willing to cooperate. Modern life tends to produce a great many small pressures. Medieval life produced fewer and much larger ones, and the difference matters. Today the pulse quickens over a password forgotten, for an account nobody has opened in 3 years. A farmer's pulse quickened because a bank of dark cloud had gathered above the ridge in the last week of August, and months of labour might be undone in a single afternoon. One of those is an inconvenience. The other decided whether there would be enough bread in the house by February. Even ordinary accidents carried consequences that reached much further than they do now. A deep cut taken while splitting wood could turn serious. A badly broken leg could mean months in which a household lost its strongest pair of hands. A troublesome tooth could become a good deal more than a troublesome tooth. It does put the modern appointment with the dentist into a kinder light. It is still not an appointment anybody looks forward to, but at least nobody today suggests that the remedy involve heat, iron, and a great deal of hopeful prayer. The shape of life itself was different too, and loss was far more present than most of us are used to. Children were sometimes lost young. Illness could move through a village quickly. Mothers faced real danger in childbirth. Families came to know grief in a way that is difficult for many modern societies to picture. And yet that constant awareness sometimes turned outward into something unexpected. Life felt fragile. And because it felt fragile, the ordinary hours were not treated as ordinary. A saint's day, a wedding, a good harvest safely under cover, a table with everybody at it, a child growing strong through a hard winter, none of these were assumed. They were marked, because everyone understood how quickly the ground could shift. We are rather good at postponing our happiness. I will rest after this project. I will enjoy things properly once the promotion comes through. I will spend more time at home next year when it is quieter. The finish line moves politely out of reach each time we approach it. Medieval people could not always afford that particular illusion because tomorrow was never a promise anyone could make. So when the village gathered for a feast, they laughed loudly. When the musicians began, they danced. When friends sat together over ale beside the fire, they stayed a little longer than they had meant to. Not because life was easy, but because they knew exactly how difficult it could turn. Perhaps that is the quiet thought underneath all of it. Their world was not calm because it was free of hardship. It was calmer, in places, because hardship was understood to be part of a human life, rather than proof that something had gone terribly and personally wrong. That understanding did not remove the pain. It simply kept the pain more often from turning into an endless, circling unease. Still, for all the gentleness we have found so far, medieval life had one enormous disadvantage. When things went wrong, they went wrong thoroughly, and there was very little middle ground to stand on. Most of the year followed its familiar shape. People worked, worshipped, celebrated, and watched the light change over the same hills. And then, now and again, trouble arrived with no warning at all, and the steady routine that had held everything together simply vanished within a week. The heaviest thing to carry was not daily life, it was uncertainty. Then the sky closes over. The rain begins, and it does not stop that afternoon, or the next, or the one after. The furrows fill, and the field becomes a shallow brown river. The grain begins to spoil where it stands. He looks out each hour hoping the weather will break, and it does not. That is not merely disappointing, that is frightening in a way most of us are fortunate never to learn. Today, a lean month may mean careful budgeting for a while. A failed harvest could put an entire village in difficulty. Grain prices rose sharply after a poor season, bread grew dear, and families quietly stretched every meal a little further than it wished to go. Even lords in comfortable halls watched with concern when 2 or 3 bad years came in a row, because a hungry countryside was an uneasy countryside, and history shows again and again that hungry people do not stay patient forever. Then there was sickness. Much of our modern worry concerns troubles that never actually arrive. Medieval illness had the unhappy habit of arriving in person. A fever spreading through a parish was not something followed at a distance. It was in the house next door. Familiar faces were missing from the fields. The church bell was rung more often than anyone wished. Nobody yet knew anything of bacteria or viruses. Physicians and village healers worked with the very best knowledge they had, which meant the balance of the humours, herbs gathered in their season, long experience, careful observation, and a considerable quantity of hope. Hope, unfortunately, is difficult to measure into a cup. War added another layer. Even for those who never carried a spear, armies rarely passed through a district without leaving it changed. Fields were trampled, livestock driven off, stores emptied, and people came along the road from villages only a few days distant, carrying news that nobody wanted to hear. Suddenly a quiet corner of the world felt considerably less quiet. And yet here is the remarkable part. When these waves passed, people returned to ordinary life with astonishing speed. The fields still needed turning. Children still shouted in the lane. The market reopened, a little thinner at first, and then fuller. The bells rang for a wedding again instead of a burial. Life went forward because it had no other direction available to it. Perhaps we sometimes struggle more in the aftermath of hardship because we have quietly come to expect that comfort is the natural state of things. Medieval people never held that expectation. They understood that peace was precious, precisely because it was breakable. Their greatest strain did not come as a constant background pressure. It came in great waves, and then, whenever fortune allowed, everyday life crept back into its old channel, and people took it up again with a gratitude that many of us only discover after our own lives have been unexpectedly turned over. Here is the curious thing. If certain parts of medieval life were described to a modern researcher, with the castles and the harvest failures left out, they might well nod along and remark that those sound like rather good conditions for a steady mind. Over the last several decades, a great deal of study has gone into what makes people calmer and steadier, and the findings keep landing near conclusions that would have seemed entirely obvious to a villager in Lincolnshire or Limousin. Take daylight and sleep. It is said that natural morning light helps settle the body's inner clock, and that time spent outdoors early in the day tends to be reflected in the quality of the night that follows. A medieval farmer would have shrugged at the news. Of course, he was outside at sunrise. Cows have never shown the slightest interest in respecting a lie-in, or take exercise. Today, a great many people drive to a building full of machines in order to walk on a moving belt, while watching somebody else walk through a forest on a screen. A medieval peasant would have found this genuinely baffling. You pay, he might ask, in order to pretend to walk. Physical effort was never a separate compartment of medieval life, something to be scheduled and then quietly avoided. It was simply what living consisted of, from the first bucket carried up from the well at dawn to the last armful of wood brought in at dusk. Almost every errand in a medieval village was walked. Water was carried, wood was split, ground was dug and planted and turned again, fences were mended, and the road to the mill and back was covered with a sack balanced across one shoulder. Bodies stayed in motion through nearly every waking hour, not out of any ambition to be strong or lean, but because there was no other way to reach the end of a day. There is a quiet irony in that. A great deal of modern effort now goes into gently persuading people to move a little more, while a 14th century villager, who had never once heard the word exercise, had managed a full morning of it before the porridge was ready, and would not have thought of it as anything at all. Those who study human contentment tend to arrive, again and again, at the same unglamorous conclusion, which is that close and lasting relationships seem to matter enormously over the length of a life, and that people held inside a steady circle of others often come through hard stretches more. Companionship worked in much the same accidental way, easily, than those who faced them alone. Village life supplied that circle whether anyone had asked for it or not. Neighbours were not optional. Some of them were tiresome. Some borrowed a scythe and returned it in a condition that raised questions nobody quite wanted to ask aloud. But they were there, unavoidably there, and when a roof gave way, or a cow wandered off, or a family lost its footing, they generally turned up. Rhythm mattered as well. A predictable day asks less of the mind, because so much of it has already been settled by custom and by the hour. The medieval calendar was, in its way, one long and steady routine, marked out by market days and feast days and the turning of the fields, and interrupted now and then by a loose goose expressing strong opinions across the green. Nobody stood at the edge of the morning choosing from an endless field of possibilities. The morning had already chosen. Thankfulness, too, arrived without instruction. Medieval people needed no reminder to be glad of a full barn, a healthy child, or a warm meal at the end of a long winter, because they understood exactly how easily such things could slip away. Gratitude was not a habit anyone set out to practice. It was simply what a good harvest felt like. And yet, having said all of that gently, the honest reckoning still has to be made. Nobody should wish away the antibiotics, or clean water arriving at the turn of a tap, or painless dentistry, or vaccination, or the machine that quietly washes the clothes while the household sleeps. Nobody should wish away the astonishing luxury of a world in which a small cut while slicing bread is a passing annoyance rather than the defining event of a year. The point of wandering through those villages was never to argue that anyone ought to go back. It is only to notice that invention has solved an enormous number of physical problems with remarkable success, and has been far less able to reach the quieter troubles that live inside a person's own thoughts. So the verdict, after all of it, is not that medieval life was better. It was not. It was a different set of burdens, and not a lighter one. Illness arrived without warning, and with little that could be done about it. Harvests failed. Childbirth was dangerous. Choices were few, and for most people the shape of a life was largely decided long before they were old enough to hold views on the matter. If anyone were offered the chance to trade places tomorrow morning, most would ask a single practical question before answering, and the answer would end the conversation fairly quickly. But folded inside those hard lives were habits that keep resurfacing in modern thinking as though newly discovered. To live within easy reach of other people, to spend the day outdoors, to move without ever calling it movement, to keep a rhythm, to gather and celebrate often, and to accept that a great deal of life was never going to sit inside anyone's control in the first place. That last one may be the deepest difference of all. Medieval people did not expect life to be perfect. They expected it to be unpredictable. It is only that when a parcel arrives a day late, or a message goes unanswered, or 100 small frustrations stack themselves one on top of another until the whole pile feels heavier than any single thing in it, there can be something oddly steadying about the thought of a baker in a market town. Those are two very different ways to stand in the world, and the distance between them is wider than it looks. There is no lesson being handed down here, and no instruction. The past is not a set of directions. Who would have listened to every word of it with genuine concern, and then asked kindly whether everyone at home was well? Perspective does not make a difficulty imaginary. Modern worry is real, and it wears at people precisely because it never quite finishes. It is simply that human beings were shaped by seasons, and by shared work, and by evenings that felt like evenings, rather than by 1,000 small demands arriving in a steady stream from every direction at once. History is not only a record of how far we have travelled. Sometimes it is a soft reminder of what was set down along the way. And perhaps whatever makes a life feel less pressed upon has never been waiting in some brilliant invention just over the horizon. Perhaps it has been sitting quietly for centuries in the ordinary rhythm of a village, patiently suggesting that a good life has never been measured by how much was done in it, but by how fully the ordinary hours in between were lived. So let the fields fade now, and the church bell, and the smoke drifting from the cottages. Far to the east, another world is waking, and it is waking in the dark. Long before the first light climbs over the mountains of Central Asia, the day of a caravan has already begun. Nothing rings, and nobody is startled awake. Travellers rise because centuries of hard-won experience have taught every caravan leader the same lesson. The cool hours belong to those who move, and every minute spent sleeping past dawn is another minute walking beneath an afternoon sun that shows no mercy at all. Whether the road ahead skirts the Taklamakan, climbs onto the Iranian plateau, or runs out across the wind-scoured grassland near Samarkand, the rule does not change. Leave early or pay for it later. Eyes open beneath a woolen blanket stiff with the night's cold. Desert nights have a way of insisting that yesterday's blazing heat was only ever borrowed. The stars still hang overhead in numbers that are difficult to imagine now, undimmed by any city, unmarked by any moving light, and the silence beneath them is nearly complete. It is broken only by the occasional low grumble of a camel who appears to have serious objections to the entire concept of morning. The camp is little more than scattered shapes in the dark. Merchants from China sleep a few paces from Persian traders. Sogdian interpreters lie curled beneath heavy cloaks, their many languages folded away until dawn. A Buddhist monk rests near a Muslim camel driver, each keeping his own hours of prayer, each long accustomed to the other. Somewhere beyond them, a spice merchant from India sleeps with remarkable confidence for a man carrying a good portion of his family's fortune across several thousand miles of difficult country. Along this road, difference is not remarkable. It is simply the condition of travel. Nobody shouts. The camp stirs slowly instead, the way a large animal stretches before it stands. A cough carries through the dark. Someone feeds another handful of fuel into a fire that had almost given up, and a small orange glow returns to it. Leather bags rustle, wooden bowls knock softly together. A caravan might be a few dozen travellers, or several hundred, and the largest expeditions moved with hundreds of animals carrying bolts of silk, crated porcelain, sacks of pepper and cinnamon, paper, cut stones, glassware, perfumes, ivory, and now and then a diplomatic gift of a value that would. A horse stamps at the hard ground, impatient already. Sleeping late, it turns out, is a luxury reserved for people who own houses rather than camels. Make a whole province nervous. Every animal, every crate, and every person has a place in the order of march, and that order is kept with something close to military care. Confusion on a road like this is not merely irritating. It is expensive, and occasionally a good deal worse than expensive. It is worth saying, while the camp is still coming to itself, that there was never really a single road. What later ages gathered under one tidy name was in truth a loose and shifting web of tracks, river crossings, mountain passes and oasis towns, braiding together and pulling apart according to weather, water, and whoever happened to be keeping the peace that decade. Goods moved instead in relays, changing hands and changing owners at market after market, so that a bolt of silk woven in a workshop near the Yellow River might pass through 6 or 7 pairs of hands before it was unrolled in a hall beside the Mediterranean, each pair adding a little to the. Very few merchants travelled its whole length. Price, and none of them ever meeting the others. The road was less a journey than a very long conversation, carried on by strangers. There is no packing in any leisurely sense. Blankets are folded, possessions gathered, and everything a traveller owns must either sit on their own back or go onto a camel that already holds several opinions about the arrangement. Then, for a moment, everyone looks east. The horizon has begun to shift from black towards the deepest blue. Dawn is still hidden, but it is coming quickly. As that blue spreads, the camp undergoes a quiet transformation. What looked an hour ago like strangers scattered across a wilderness becomes something very like a town, one with no walls, no square, and no permanent building of any kind, and yet in which every person seems to know exactly where to stand and what to do. The robe rewards organization, and it has almost no patience for muddle. The caravan leader walks through it with a plain staff, checking without fuss that everyone is up. He does not need to raise his voice. His authority comes entirely from what he knows. He knows where the next dependable well lies, and how far away it is. He knows which mountain pass is safe this season, and which is not. Above all, he knows that a single poor judgment can strand hundreds of people in one of the least forgiving landscapes on earth, and everyone around him knows that he knows it. Small fires flicker back to life across the camp, and travellers hold their hands over them while spending as little fuel as they possibly can. Across much of Central Asia there is scarcely any firewood to be had, so dried camel and horse dung serves instead. It is not fragrant, but it burns steadily, and it is always to hand, and everyone stopped remarking on it a very long time ago. Merchants move among the packs, inspecting yesterday's cargo in the half-light. Rolls of silk stay bound inside their oiled wrappings. Sacks of pepper, cinnamon, cloves and saffron are checked for damp because moisture ruins a spice more thoroughly than any thief. Porcelain is unwrapped and turned in the hand and looked over for the fine crack that a night of swaying against a camel's flank can open. One damaged crate can erase the profit of months before the journey is even half done. The languages around the fires are as mixed as the merchandise. Persian carries across the camp beside Sogdian, Turkic dialects fold into Chinese, and there is Arabic and Sanskrit, and now and then a little Greek. Almost nobody follows every conversation, which is precisely why interpreters are among the most valued members of any expedition. On this road, someone who can move easily between 4 tongues is worth a great deal and generally knows it. The animals announce themselves next. Camels groan with tremendous drama, as though personally wronged by the arrival of another day. Horses snort into the cold. Donkeys bray without warning or apology. The bells on the harnesses begin their soft, uneven chorus, drifting out across the empty land, and anyone still asleep after that has chosen an unpopular course. Breakfast, when it comes, is brisk. Nobody unrolls a cloth or debates what they feel like eating. The meal must be quick, filling and easy to carry, and what appears depends entirely on who is carrying it. A merchant from northern China unwraps steamed wheat buns made the evening before. A Persian trader tears strips from a flat loaf and dips them into a soft cheese pressed from sheep's milk. A traveller from India eats dried fruit turned through with nuts, while Turkic herdsmen pass around fermented milk, rich and sour and remarkably sustaining, which has been known to wake a newcomer rather more effectively than any hot drink ever brewed. Bread of one kind or another sits beneath nearly every breakfast on the road. Flatbreads keep for days inside a leather bag without spoiling, which makes them close to the ideal travelling food, and they are eaten alongside dates, raisins, figs, almonds, walnuts and pistachios, all of them heavy with energy and light enough to carry across a continent. Fresh fruit is a rare pleasure, saved for the days when the caravan passes through a fertile valley or comes down into a city. Meat appears occasionally, dried or salted weeks earlier. Cooking anything fresh before sunrise would mean delay, and delay has an unfortunate habit of turning into something more serious once the afternoon heat arrives. Water is handled with something close to reverence. Nobody pours a generous cup simply because they happen to be thirsty. Every mouthful is counted, and the caravan leader carries in his head the exact reckoning of how much remains in each skin and how many days lie between the company and the next reliable spring. What is wasted this morning becomes hardship the day after tomorrow. Waiting at the end of a good day's march, on the better travelled stretches at least, stands one of the great practical inventions of the age. The caravanserai was a square of thick walls set out at roughly the distance. A loaded camel could comfortably cover in a day, with a gate that closed at dusk. Stalls along the inside, a well in the middle, and rooms above for sleeping. Rulers built them, merchants endowed them, and travellers of every faith and language shared them for a night without much ceremony, which is perhaps the truest picture of the road there is. Tea is spreading along the eastern stretches of the route, and Chinese merchants often carry it pressed into hard bricks that can be chipped apart and brewed over the morning fire. Further west, infusions of local herbs gathered at earlier stops are the more familiar comfort. Either way, the cup is small, and it is finished quickly. Nobody lingers by the fire. Bowls are wiped clean, whatever is left over vanishes into travel bags, and every crumb is treated as the small piece of value it is. Breakfast ends about as suddenly as it began, and is replaced at once by the real labour of the morning. Several hundred camels are waiting to be loaded, and not one of them has volunteered to make it easy. Out beyond the last of the tents, the camels are still resting, their legs folded neatly beneath them, so that they sit low against the ground like heavy ships drawn up on a quiet shore. At this hour they seem almost serene, their jaws moving slowly from side to side, their eyes half closed against the pale early light. It would be easy to mistake them for the most peaceable creatures in all of Asia. Anyone who has travelled with them knows better. The moment the first rope is drawn tight across a load, opinions are expressed. One long rolling complaint drifts across the camp. Another answers it from somewhere near the water barrels, and within a minute the whole caravan seems to be debating, at length and with feeling, the general unfairness of early mornings. They are forgiven almost at once because there is no animal better suited to this road. The Bactrian camel of Central Asia is not built for speed, and it is certainly not built for glory. It is built to keep going. Its two humps store fat rather than water, a reserve the body draws upon slowly when grazing is thin and the next well is still days away. Its coat thickens into a shaggy winter mantle against the cold of the high steppe, then falls away in ragged clumps when the season turns. Its feet are broad and padded, spreading the animal's weight across loose sand, much as a snowshoe spreads weight across a drift. A strong camel is said to have carried something close to 400 pounds, and to have walked with it day after day through country that would have exhausted almost anything else. Long before wheels and engines reshaped the world, this was one of its great transport technologies, and the merchants who depended on it knew exactly what they had. Loading such an animal is a craft in itself, and it is not done quickly. The weight on either side must balance, or the whole arrangement begins to work against the camel with every step. A crate of porcelain from the kilns of China cannot simply be lashed to one flank while sacks of pepper hang from the other and the difference ignored. An uneven load rubs, then shifts, and a camel that stumbles on a narrow trail can send a fortune down a slope in a single moment. One chest of broken porcelain or shattered glassware might represent a whole year of a merchant's profit, so the packing is done with all the seriousness it deserves. Experienced handlers know where everything belongs almost without thinking. Heavy goods ride low, snug against the animal's sides. Fragile wares are wrapped in layers of felt, straw, leather, or coarse woven cloth, so that every jolt of the road is absorbed by something soft before it reaches the thing that matters. Bolts of silk are kept well away from damp, since a little moisture can ruin a cloth worth more than the camel carrying it. Spices are sealed against the dust that finds its way into everything else. As for coins, gemstones, seals and letters, those tend to travel a good deal closer to their owners than anyone watching would ever guess. A careful merchant does not announce where his fortune is kept. He simply keeps it, quietly, and lets the loudest bundles on the outside be the ones that hold cooking pots. There is an order to all of it, worked out over generations. The trade goods go on first, because they are the reason the journey exists at all. Then come the tents, the cooking gear, the tools, the spare harness and rope, the water skins, the grain and the dried fruit. Personal belongings are fitted into whatever space is left over, which is never quite as much as anyone hoped. This is the moment when a traveller reconsiders the extra blanket, the second pair of boots, the small unnecessary comfort that seemed so reasonable back in the last town. Out here, everything has to justify its weight. Not every animal carries merchandise. Some carry people. An elderly trader making a last journey along a road he has walked for 40 years. Children travelling with a family that moves goods between cities. A scribe whose task is to record every transaction in a ledger that will be argued over in some distant market. A large caravan can be a moving village of several hundred souls, and it carries the trades a village needs: a smith who can mend a broken fitting, someone who understands the ailments of animals, cooks who somehow produce an evening meal for everyone out of a few sacks, a couple of iron pots, and a physician rides with his bundles of dried herbs. Guards ride with their weapons close at hand. Fire made of whatever will burn. Then, one by one, the loaded camels are asked to stand, and the camp begins to empty. Watching a camel rise is a small event in itself. The hind legs straighten first, tipping everything sharply forward. The front legs unfold a moment later, throwing everything back again. Riders learn to lean into it, and those who forget tend to learn once and never forget again. In the end, the long line stretches out toward the horizon, each animal carrying its own small share of the world's wealth, and the road ahead simply waits. What a traveller wears on such a journey has almost nothing to do with appearance. Along the Silk Road, clothing is equipment, as practical as a water skin or a coil of rope, and the difference between comfort and real trouble can come down to how well a person is dressed. It begins with the innermost layer, usually a plain tunic of linen or cotton, chosen because those fabrics breathe and draw sweat away from the skin during the long hours ahead. A wealthy merchant might wear something finer, softly woven and brought from some distant workshop. A hired driver wears something rougher, made to survive being washed in cold water and dried on a rock. Over that goes a heavier robe of wool or thick woven cloth, and at first this seems entirely backwards. Surely under a blazing sun, less cloth would be cooler. It is not so. Loose layers trap still air against the body and hold the sun's heat at a distance, while shielding the skin from glare, from wind, and from blowing sand. Across the deserts of Asia, covering up is the cooler choice, and it is one of the first lessons the road teaches. At the waist goes a broad leather belt, and it does a great deal more than hold a robe closed. It is where the day's essentials live: a small knife for cutting bread or trimming a frayed rope, a pouch of coins minted in 3 or 4 different kingdoms, a striker for making fire, perhaps a wooden spoon, and quite often a small charm or amulet thought to bring good fortune. Beliefs travelled this road as readily as silk did, and a great many of them found a home on somebody's belt. Feet deserve the most attention of all. There are no modern boots here, only sturdy leather footwear or thick sandals chosen for the season and for the ground. Soles are reinforced against sharp stone and thorn, and strips of cloth are wound around the feet to soften the rub of a long day. It sounds like a small thing. It is not. A blistered foot several hundred miles from the nearest town is a serious inconvenience at best, and every seasoned traveller treats it accordingly. Last comes the head covering, which might be a felt cap, a length of cloth wound into a turban, or a fur-lined hat for the mountain stages. The same road that freezes before dawn can be punishing by midday, so head coverings are loosened and rewrapped again and again as the hours pass, opened for air when the wind is kind and drawn close when the sand begins to move. Looking along the line, the variety is remarkable. Merchants from China in long robes fastened neatly across the chest, Persian traders in flowing garments and bright woven belts, Turkic horsemen in short practical riding coats made for a life spent mounted, travellers from the Tibetan highlands wrapped in heavy wool and fur against cold they know is coming. Different lands, different tailoring, different ideas of what looks well, and underneath it all the same shared understanding. Out here, what a person wears is what keeps them going. Before anyone moves, though, A quiet settles over the camp, and it has nothing to do with cargo. Hundreds of travellers take a few moments for themselves. They have come from opposite ends of a continent, carrying their own languages, customs and convictions. And to stand in the middle of the camp at this hour is to watch half the world greet the morning at once. A Muslim merchant unrolls a small rug on a patch of level ground and performs the dawn prayer, one of the 5 that give shape to his day, whether he happens to be in Baghdad, in Bukhara, or somewhere in the long empty spaces between. His companions take care not to pass in front of him while he prays. Trade matters, but it can wait its turn. A little further on, a Buddhist monk sits very still with his legs crossed and everything he owns bundled at his side, moving a string of beads slowly through his fingers as he recites under his breath, preparing the mind before preparing the feet. Across the way, a Christian from Mesopotamia, of the tradition that carried the faith eastward along these very roads, makes the sign of the cross before finishing the last of his flatbread. Nearby, a Zoroastrian trader from Persia turns toward the growing light and offers prayers concerned with truth and with the right order of the world. The brightening sky is a reminder to him of the divine light, though he does not worship the sun itself, whatever outsiders have sometimes assumed. Chinese merchants keep their own customs. Some light a pinch of fragrant incense before a small travelling shrine, honouring their ancestors or the protective figures believed to watch over those who trade far from home. Others simply bow toward a wooden tablet kept carefully wrapped among their belongings. Along this road, family stayed close even when home lay thousands of miles behind. Then there are the rituals of the practical kind, and they are performed with equal seriousness. Camel drivers stoop to check hooves one last time. Horsemen test the tightness of saddle straps. Guards run whetstones along blade edges and look for wear in bowstrings. The physician sorts through his bundles of dried herbs to be certain the cold night has left them dry. The cooks count their flour, their salt, and their dried fruit before the sacks vanish beneath a mountain of cargo. Nobody laughs at these habits, because every traveller here has learned that small routines prevent large troubles. A loose strap noticed now is a minor thing. The same strap discovered halfway along a mountain trail is not. Even when the sun has climbed clear of the horizon and the peaks have turned the colour of honey, no one gives the order to leave. A caravan never simply picked a direction and set off in hope. Instead, the leader gathers his senior merchants, his scouts, the camel masters and the captain of the guards, and they compare everything they have learned over the past few days. It is less a council of war than a conversation among people who have all been paying close attention. One scout reports that the river crossing ahead is still passable after last week's rain. Another has found that a stretch of mountain path has partly given way, which means a longer route through a neighbouring valley. The extra days are unwelcome. They are also a great deal better than the alternative. News moves along the Silk Road faster than any single traveller does. Every way station, every market, every village with a well becomes a place where information is traded alongside goods. Merchants arrive carrying not only bales and boxes but knowledge, which ruler has raised his tolls, where a new well has been dug, which bridge went out in the spring, whether anyone has met with trouble on a particular stretch of road. Some of it is entirely accurate. Some of it grows a little with each retelling, until 3 unfamiliar riders seen at dusk have become, by the 5th version, a small army. Learning which reports deserve attention is a skill worth as much as any map. Maps do exist, hand-drawn and often covering only a portion of a network that runs from the cities of China to the shores of the Mediterranean. But no map can tell a traveller whether yesterday's sandstorm has buried the landmark he was counting on, or whether meltwater has turned a shallow stream into something that will not be crossed this week. That kind of knowledge lives in the people who walk the route. So the caravan leader reads the sky as carefully as he reads the ground, watching for high thin cloud drifting in from the west, noticing a morning wind that hints at dust by afternoon, taking in the behavior of birds, the drift of smoke from a distant camp, even the smell carried on the air. A newcomer sees a landscape. He sees a forecast. Last of all comes security. The guards look over spears, bows, and curved swords one more time, not because they expect trouble today, but because valuable cargo has always drawn attention, and silk, silver, spices, and gemstones were tempting to anyone willing to risk taking them. In truth, most caravans seem to have avoided danger by arithmetic rather than by courage, travelling in greater numbers, choosing the safer road, leaving earlier in the day. A confrontation avoided was worth a great deal more than one survived. At last the leader gives a single nod. Scouts move to the front. Guards spread along the flanks. Merchants take their places beside their animals. Everything that can be checked has been checked, and everything that can be foreseen has been foreseen, which leaves only the part that no amount of preparation ever fully governs, which is the journey itself. The order to depart is never shouted. It does not need to be. Drivers speak quietly to their animals. A lead rope tightens, and all along the line the great shapes begin to rise, back legs first and front legs after, the cargo rocking forward and then back. Behind them the camp comes apart with practiced speed. Cooking fires are smothered with sand until not one ember glows, because nobody wishes to leave a signal for others to follow, or a spark loose in dry grass. Tent poles are bound into bundles, blankets lashed onto packs, and within a very short time there is almost nothing left to show that several hundred people passed the night in this place at all. The wind will see to the rest of it by evening. And far to the west, in another country and another century, a different kind of morning is already underway. Long before the gates are opened, long before the kitchens fill with the smell of new bread, long before the lord of the place stirs beneath his woolen blankets, a castle is awake. Not all of it. Most of it is still deeply asleep. But high on the curtain wall the last watch of the night is being kept, and that watch has always been reckoned the longest one. Stone holds the cold, and a fortress that looks so grand from a distance has an unfortunate talent for letting the wind find every gap and corner it can. Even in summer, the hours before sunrise can be surprisingly sharp up there. Beyond the walls the countryside lies almost entirely silent, field after dark field of it, waiting for a light that has not quite arrived. Long before the household stirs, the castle keeps a quieter kind of life. A thin mist gathers over the fields below the walls, pale as breath on cold glass. An owl finishes the last of its hunting somewhere out in the dark, and a fox slicks back into the hedgerow without a sound. The village at the foot of the hill is only a scattering of low shapes beneath an enormous field of stars. There are no lamps along the lanes, no distant murmur of engines, none of that faint electric hum that runs underneath a modern night. There is only the wind moving along the battlements, the occasional soft collapse of a torch burning down to nothing, and the great dark bulk of the stone itself, holding the warmth of the day a little longer than the air around it. On the wall walk, a watchman moves slowly between the towers. Every few minutes he pauses and looks out along the roads that lead toward the gate, letting his eyes settle until the pale ribbon of the track separates itself from the darker fields. A good many people travel by night, and not all of them for the same reasons. Merchants sometimes set out hours before sunrise so that they can reach a market by mid-morning. Messengers carrying urgent news ride whenever the news demands it, which is rarely at a convenient hour, and those with less honest business have always preferred the cover of darkness too. Tonight the roads are empty, and that is exactly what everyone hopes for. Still, nobody on watch is allowed to drift. A castle stands not only because its walls are thick, but because someone, at every hour, is paying attention. Down in the courtyard, only a few lanterns are still burning. Yesterday's fires have sunk into deep beds of embers, banked under ash to keep a little heat alive until morning. The great hall is dark and echoing, and completely empty. The stables are peaceful except for the shifting of hooves in straw and the occasional heavy sigh of a horse, dreaming, one imagines, of a long green meadow and a day with nothing at all strapped to its back. From the outside, it looks like a building that has gone entirely to sleep. Appearances are deceiving. Inside the gatehouse, the night guards are already murmuring to the men who will replace them, passing along whatever small details the darkness produced. In the chapel, an elderly priest has risen and begun the first prayers of the day in a voice pitched barely above a whisper. In the kitchens, one of the senior cooks is stirring, because anyone who has fed 100 people knows that breakfast cannot be conjured in the last 10 minutes before it is wanted. The truth is that life inside a castle never entirely stops. While the lord and lady sleep beneath heavy coverlets and layers of wool, a quiet population of servants works on through the small hours. Grooms look in on the most valuable horses. Bakers set dough to rise so that it is ready when the ovens reach their heat. Someone may sit up with a servant who is unwell, or with a soldier who arrived after sunset and needs looking after. Every hour of the night belongs to somebody, which is another way of saying that somebody is always tired. Then, slowly, the eastern horizon shifts from black to a deep, soft blue, and the first grey light begins to spread across the countryside. The longest watch of the night is nearly finished. For the castle as a whole, the day's real work has not yet begun. As the light strengthens, the stillness comes apart. The changing of the watch happens without ceremony. The guards who have spent the night on the battlements come down toward the gatehouse with damp cloaks and tired faces, thinking mostly of hot porridge and a few hours of sleep. The fresh guards pass them going the other way, still fastening belts and settling helmets, and the handover is the same brief exchange it has always been. Anything unusual? If the answer is nothing at all, everyone relaxes a little. If the answer is anything else, the morning has just become considerably more complicated. At this hour, the gatehouse is the busiest building in the castle, and it is far more than a pair of doors. It is a small fortress built inside the larger one, because the entrance is where a wall is necessarily weakest, and medieval builders thought about that weakness constantly. The gates themselves are oak, several inches thick, bound and studded with iron. Above them sits the portcullis, a heavy lattice of iron-shod timber that can be dropped in seconds if something goes wrong. In the ceiling of the passage there are openings through which defenders could act against anyone who forced a way inside. All of it is welcoming enough, provided one is arriving in peace. The captain of the guard begins his inspection while the light is still thin. He checks that the locking beams have not warped or split overnight. He looks over the hinges for cracks, tests the chains that carry the drawbridge, and has every mechanism worked through once before anyone trusts it with the full weight of the day. This is unglamorous work, and it never appears in the songs. But a chain that fails at the wrong moment turns an ordinary morning into a very expensive lesson about engineering. Castles were kept standing by patient maintenance far more often than by heroics. Outside the walls, people have already gathered. Farmers wait with carts of vegetables, eggs, butter and cheese still cool from the dairy. A fisherman stands with baskets from the river, the night's catch packed in wet reeds. Two merchants wait beside heavily loaded mules, hoping to interest the household in cloth or salt or wine brought a long way at considerable trouble. None of them expects the gates to open simply because they arrived early. Security comes before commerce, and everyone present understands the order of things. One by one the visitors are looked over. Familiar faces get a nod and little else. Strangers get questions. Where have you come from? Who are you here to see? What is under that cloth? There are no papers, no identity documents, nothing to check against a list. Instead, there is reputation, which in a world of small communities was a surprisingly reliable currency. A miller who has supplied the castle for 20 years and whose father supplied it before him is treated very differently from a traveller nobody recognizes. Caution is not thought rude. It is simply how people stayed safe. At last, the order is given. Several men take hold of the thick wooden handles of the winch, and the portcullis rises with a deep metallic rattle that carries right across the courtyard and comes back off the far wall. Others push at the great gates, which swing outward with a long groaning complaint, their hinges stiff after a damp night. For the first time since sunset, the castle opens itself to the world outside. Almost at once the courtyard begins to fill. Carts rumble across the boards of the drawbridge. A messenger hurries through with a sealed letter held against his chest. Boys lead wagons toward the storehouses while the guards watch every newcomer with the practiced, unhurried attention of people who have done this 10,000 times. The fortress is no longer asleep. Now comes the second waking, which has nothing to do with people and everything to do with fire. Through the night, nearly all the castle's hearths were allowed to sink low, leaving only coals buried under ash. Firewood was valuable, gathered and carted and stacked by somebody's labour, and no sensible steward would let great fires roar away at nobody while the household slept. So the morning depends entirely on yesterday's embers, and it is quietly a race against the cold. In the kitchen, a servant kneels at the enormous hearth and brushes the ash aside with careful strokes until a few orange sparks appear, small as seeds. Dry straw goes over them first, then thin twigs gathered the day before. She bends low and blows, gently, and nothing happens. She blows again. A thread of flame lifts and steadies. More kindling, then a little more, and the fire takes hold with a sound like paper being crumpled somewhere far away. Within minutes, thick oak logs are pushed into the blaze, and the largest fireplace in the castle begins to push warmth back into a room that has been cold since midnight. One fire is nowhere near enough. A large castle might hold dozens of hearths scattered through kitchens, hall, private chambers, workshops, guardrooms and towers, and each one has to be brought back to life. Servants carry glowing coals through dim corridors in iron braziers, moving quickly and watching their footing, using the borrowed heat to wake fireplaces that slept through the night. It is more delicate work than it sounds. A dropped coal can find the rushes on a floor. A neglected flue can fill a chamber with smoke. Castles were built of stone, yet their floors, beams, roofs, furniture and hangings held a great deal of wood and cloth, and fire was at once the household's most useful servant and one of the things it was most careful with. Before long, the kitchen is unrecognizable from the cold room of an hour ago. There is the crack and settle of burning logs, the clang of iron, the scrape of a heavy cauldron dragged across stone. Sparks lift into a chimney blackened by generations of cooks who stood in exactly this place doing exactly this work. The smell changes too. First wood smoke, oak and beech, sharp and clean. Then bread, as loaves come to colour inside ovens heated long before first light. Porridge thickens in great pots, Herbs and onions go into something that has been simmering since before dawn, and the scent drifts out along the passages and up the stairs. Anyone still asleep in the upper chambers is likely to wake around now, not because a polite announcement is made, but because an entire fortress has become wonderfully, unavoidably busy. Elsewhere, maids move through the darker rooms with candles and small oil lamps, replacing what burned out overnight. Daylight is spreading outside, yet thick walls and narrow windows keep many interiors dim well into the morning, and light was very nearly as precious as heat. By the time the sun clears the battlements, warmth has begun to travel through the building, and the castle stops feeling like a cold stone shell and begins to feel like a home with people in it. Not everyone wakes in the same way. In the Lord's chamber, heavy curtains let only thin blades of light through the narrow window. It is one of the warmest rooms in the castle, with a good fireplace and tapestries along the walls to hold the heat and soften the stone, and even so the air is cool enough that nobody is in a hurry to leave the bed. His day rarely begins alone. A servant comes quietly in with warmed water in a bronze basin. Another lays out the day's clothing, a linen shirt, woolen hose, a finely woven tunic, a leather belt, and a fur-lined cloak if the season calls for it. Wealthy men owned a great many garments, and dressing still needed help. Buttons were scarce, layers were numerous, and expensive cloth deserved careful handling. Nothing about it is rushed. How a noble appeared was part of how a noble governed. In the lady's chambers, the morning follows a similar shape. Her attendants brush and braid her hair, arrange her gown, and set out whatever jewelry suits the day ahead. It is worth saying that noble women were rarely idle. They oversaw servants, kept track of household stores, directed the spinning and weaving that clothed a great many people, received guests, arranged charitable giving, and in a good many cases ran the whole estate while their husbands were away for months at a time. More than one manor's accounts survive in a lady's hand. Further from the fine rooms, the morning is a good deal less elegant. The squires have been up for a while already, boys training toward knighthood who learn very quickly that sleeping late is an excellent way to acquire extra chores. They pull on plain wool and hurry toward the armory or the stables, where older knights expect armor cleaned, horses groomed, and equipment checked before anyone sits down to eat. In the stable yard, the grooms are already at work, brushing coats until they shine, picking out hooves, looking over harness for worn stitching, and handing out hay to animals permanently convinced they have not been fed in weeks. A trained warhorse represented an enormous investment, worth more than a farming family might see in years, and it was cared for accordingly. In the servants' quarters there is no slow start to anything. Maids carry clean linen along the corridors. Laundry workers haul baskets toward the washing troughs. Pages dart between chambers with messages from officials who have already begun arranging the day. It is worth remembering, amid all this warmth and bread and firelight, that the hours were long for most of them, and that a great deal of this comfort rested on other people's early rising. The steward has very likely been awake since before dawn, going through the counts of grain, ale, salt meat, candles and firewood, because a household of 200 has an unfortunate habit of emptying storehouses faster than anyone expects. The chapel fills a little as well, as people stop briefly for prayers before their duties begin and the priest prepares the first service of the day. Faith ran through castle life much as the hearths did, warming everything, tended daily, so ordinary that nobody thought to remark upon it. Within an hour, nearly every room holds footsteps and voices and purpose, which brings the household to the first real challenge of the day, which is feeding all of it. This is nothing like a family breakfast. Cooks move between the ovens, the chopping tables and the storerooms, each knowing the pattern so well that very few words are needed, and the master cook oversees it all, rather as a commander might before a march, checking the bread, tasting the porridge, making sure the day's meat has been. It is closer to provisioning a small village every single morning, with no shops, no cold storage, and no deliveries arriving at a fixed hour. The kitchen has been hours ahead of everyone else since long before dawn, properly handled. Nobles might dine spectacularly later on, but breakfast was practical, meant to carry people through a long morning of work. Bread is the foundation of nearly everything. Baskets go out filled with loaves of wheat, rye, barley, or oats, depending on the region and the household's means. The high table receives fine pale bread of carefully sifted flour, while the rest of the household eats darker, coarser loaves with more of the grain left in, which fed people perfectly well, even if they drew fewer compliments. Great pots of oat or barley porridge are ladled into wooden bowls. It looks plain, and it is, but it burns slowly and keeps a body going through the morning. Honey sweetens it when there is honey to spare. Dried fruit appears on fortunate days. Most mornings it is simply porridge, and nobody expects refinement before sunrise when there are walls to walk and fields to see to. Ale is poured more often than water, usually a weak small ale brewed for daily drinking rather than for celebration, mild enough that it appeared at table for the whole household. It is often said that this was because water could not be trusted, and there is something in that where crowded towns and uncertain sources were concerned, though some accounts suggest people also drank freely from wells and springs they knew to be good. Ale simply carried more nourishment, and it kept. Ale, at that hour of the morning, belongs to everyone. The servants drink it, the grooms drink it, the laundresses drink it, and it stands on the Lord's own table as well, beside watered wine or beside fresh milk when the dairy has been generous. It is often said that medieval people drank ale because water was dangerous, and there is a little truth in that for the more crowded towns, though many households drew perfectly good water from clean wells and cold springs. The simpler explanation is that ale was cheap and filling and faintly nourishing, and that it could be brewed at home without much trouble. The weak small ale poured out at breakfast was gentle stuff, closer to a warm drink than to anything that might interfere with a day's work. It was as much a food as it was a beverage. And as the jugs go round, the shape of the household quietly reveals itself. Nothing needs to be announced. The whole order of the castle can be read simply by noticing where people are sitting. The great hall is arranged in long wooden tables set end to end down the length of the room, and at the far end, raised a step or two above the rushes, stands the high table on its dais. There sit the lord and his family, any guest whose arrival matters, and the senior knights of the household. From that slight elevation they can see everyone, and everyone can see them, which is rather the point. Below the dais the tables run in descending order of importance, beginning with the household officers and the squires and the clerks, and going on to the trusted retainers who have served the family for years, and whose place is understood without anyone ever having to say it aloud. Servants generally eat apart, in the kitchen or the service rooms near it, and they eat quickly because their work has already begun and will not wait for them to finish. It would be pleasant to imagine all of this as solemn and hushed. It rarely is. Dogs drift hopefully beneath the benches, nosing at ankles, waiting for the crust that always eventually falls. A page carrying a jug a little too confidently tips it across a corner of the board and receives a look from the steward that could curdle milk. A knight turns back to his place to find that his loaf has quietly ceased to exist, and notices, a short way along the bench, a companion chewing with unusual innocence. Castles were centres of power, seats of law, strongholds that could hold out for months against an army. They were not, however, immune to the theft of a good piece of bread. Within half an hour it is over. The bowls empty, the baskets grow light, conversation shortens into single words and then into the scrape of benches on stone. Nobody lingers. There is an entire castle waiting to be fed and swept and mended and guarded and governed, and the meal was never meant to be an occasion. It was fuel. Now the work begins. The last wooden bowls go back to the kitchens, and the castle enters the busiest hour of its day. This is the moment when talk turns into motion. A fortress does not run itself out of habit or good intentions. Somewhere between 50 and several hundred people may live and work inside these walls, depending on the season and the fortunes of the family, and every one of them carries a task that somebody else is depending on. Let a few of those tasks slip, and the whole household feels it within days. Grain spoils in a damp corner. A leaking roof softens a beam. The horses go unfed. The ale runs short. The accounts stop matching. And long before any of that turns into a real difficulty, one man will already have a headache about it. At the centre of everything stands the steward. If the Lord owns the castle, the steward is the reason it functions. He is not a servant in any lowly sense. He is often a man of standing himself, sometimes a minor gentleman, and he holds authority over nearly every part of the household: stores, wages, provisions, purchases, staffing, discipline, and the endless small arithmetic of keeping a large body of people fed and reasonably content. While others are still finishing their bread, he is already going through the reports brought to him by scribes and senior servants. How much grain is left in the granary, and whether it will stretch to the next harvest. Whether the smith has charcoal enough for the week. How many barrels remain in the cellar, and when the next brewing is due. Whether the mill has sent up this week's flour, and if not, why not? These are not thrilling questions. They are simply the questions that decide whether everyone in the castle eats next month, which makes them the most important questions anyone will ask all day. He does not carry all of it alone. Beneath him sits a whole quiet architecture of offices, each with its own name and its own small kingdom. The marshal answers for the stables, the horses, the harness, and the men who look after them. The butler has charge of the buttery, which despite the sound of it has nothing to do with butter, and everything to do with barrels, with wine and ale, and the cups they are poured into. The pantler keeps the pantry and the bread. A chamberlain looks after the lord's private rooms, his clothes, his bed, and the people permitted anywhere near them. In a great household there may be a dozen such posts, and in a modest one, a single overworked man may hold 4 of them at once and answer to all 4 names, depending on who is calling him. It is an arrangement that grew slowly, over centuries, out of nothing more mysterious than the discovery that if nobody is specifically responsible for the candles, there will eventually be no candles. Nearby, at heavy oak tables set close to the good light of a window, the scribes unroll their parchment. Goose quills move in a steady scratching rhythm, pausing to be recut, dipping and returning. They record the rents brought in from the villagers, the costs of repair, the deliveries from merchants and piddlers, the sums owed to craftsmen for work already done. Some of it goes into rolls that will be checked and rechecked and stored for years, because a disputed rent or a forgotten debt can turn into a quarrel that outlives everyone who began it. Reading and writing are specialist skills here, and those who possess them are valued accordingly. Knights defend the estate with steel, clerks defend it with ink, and over a long enough span of years, the ink very likely saves more of it. Outside in the courtyard, the day's assignments are handed out in the cold morning air. The master mason gathers a few labourers and points them toward a stretch of the outer wall, where winter frost has crept into the joints and opened hairline cracks in the mortar. Water freezes, expands, and patiently takes stone apart, and it is the slowest and most reliable enemy any fortress ever faces. A carpenter is sent to see to a stable door that has been giving way at the hinge, before a particularly opinionated horse concludes that the world beyond it looks worth investigating. Roofers climb their ladders with bundles of shingles on their shoulders, hoping to finish before the next rain arrives to demonstrate exactly why the work mattered. In another corner of the yard, the forge wakes. The bellows sigh. The charcoal glows from dull red to a fierce yellow, and the ringing of hammer on hot iron begins to carry across the whole castle, a sound so constant that people stop hearing it altogether and notice only on the rare days it is absent. Horses need shoes, and horses need shoes remarkably often. Hinges need mending. Knives need their edges put back on them. Now and then a piece of armour arrives dented from a tournament, looking rather less magnificent than its owner remembers it looking at the time. The armourer takes it without comment. He has seen far worse come through that door, and he will see worse again. Beyond the workshops, the servants scatter in every direction. Some sweep the great hall in case a visitor of importance appears, since word tends to travel ahead of travellers, and nobody wishes to be caught unready. Others scrub the flagstones, carry laundry down to the water, trim and replace candles, or bring in armfuls of fresh rushes and sweet herbs to lay across the floors, gathering up the old ones that have done their duty and are ready to go. It is easy, looking at a castle from a distance, to see only the towers and the banners. Up close, it is a building that asks for relentless, unglamorous attention, and without it the grandeur would fade very quickly indeed, along with a good deal of the pleasantness of the air. At some point in the morning the steward meets the reeve, the official who oversees the working of the estate beyond the walls. Between them they settle what the countryside will do today, which fields are to be ploughed and which left to rest, where the shepherd should take the flock now that the low pasture is grazed down, which woodland the cutters may take timber from, and how much of it. Whether the forester has found any sign of poaching in the Lord's hunting ground, a matter taken very seriously indeed. The castle looks self-sufficient from the outside, all thick walls and closed gates, but it is nothing of the kind. It is the stone heart of a much larger living body, made of villages and fields and mills and woods, and if that body stops working, the heart runs out of food within a season, however high its walls may stand. Within an hour, the whole place hums. Orders have been given, tools are moving, mortar is being mixed, dough is rising in the bakehouse, wool is being carded somewhere out of the wind. The fortress works rather like an enormous machine assembled entirely out of people, each one a gear that turns because the gear beside it turns. And while all these hundreds keep ordinary life running, there is another group inside the walls whose work has nothing to do with ordinary life at all. Their responsibility is to make certain the castle is ready for the day that is not ordinary. So while the carpenters mend doors, and the cooks begin thinking about dinner, and the steward wades through his lists, another routine unfolds along the walls, and this one is never skipped. The defences must be checked. A quiet morning means very little to the captain of the guard, because his whole purpose is to be prepared for the mornings that are not quiet, and those, by every account we have, tend to arrive without an appointment. The changing of the watch moves along the battlements as fresh men come up to replace those who have stood through the night. There are brief exchanges as they pass. The same handful of questions asked at dawn for generations. Did anyone come near the gate in the dark? Were any fires seen out toward the hills? Has any traveller been reported on the road who did not much resemble a traveller? Most mornings the answers are wonderfully dull, and dull is precisely what every commander of a castle hopes to hear. The men take their stations along the curtain wall, in the gatehouse, in the towers, and at the corners where the land opens out, and can be watched for miles in clear weather. Those coming off duty go down the stair stiff with cold, hands wrapped around whatever warmth they can find, and the ones going up settle into the long, patient business of looking at a landscape where almost nothing will happen. It is not glamorous work. It is mostly weather, and waiting, and the same view growing slowly lighter. The captain begins his inspection where any sensible man would, at the gatehouse. It is the strongest and most thoroughly defended part of the fortress, because it is also the part with an opening in it, and everyone involved is keenly aware of that fact. He looks over the great oak leaves of the gate, swung back at first light, and satisfies himself that they can be closed and barred without fuss if the need ever comes. The portcullis is raised and lowered once, so that the chains run and the counterweights answer and the grooves cut into the stone stay clear. A seized mechanism or a frayed rope discovered in the middle of a real emergency would be the sort of discovery nobody wishes to make twice. He glances too at the passage overhead, where openings in the vault allow the defenders above to reach whatever might be happening below, and at the drawbridge chains if the castle has a ditch, and at the little wicket door set into the great gate for the ordinary traffic of ordinary days. Then the walls. Walking the battlements slowly, he reads the stonework much as the steward reads his accounts, looking for the small failure that will one day become a large one. Frost, rain, root, and time work away at even the thickest masonry, and it is fair to say that every wall in Europe is quietly losing an argument with the weather. Cracks are marked with chalk for the masons. Loose stones are pulled out and set aside for replacement. Whatever can be repaired now is repaired now, because trouble has a habit of arriving before the scaffolding does. The archers, meanwhile, see to their equipment with the particular fussiness of people whose safety depends on small details. Longbows are kept unstrung overnight, so that the yew does not take a permanent bend and lose its spring, so the morning begins with the bows being strung again and drawn a few times to be sure of them. Bowstrings, spun from hemp or flax and sometimes from sinew, are run through the fingers and checked along their length for fraying, and a doubtful string is replaced rather than trusted. Arrows are counted, genuinely counted, one by one, because arrows are expensive and fletching is slow work. Damaged shafts are set aside, and fresh sheaves are carried up to the racks that stand ready along the wall walk. Crossbows take even more care. Their prods, whether of wood or horn or steel, are examined for splits. The windlass and the goat's foot lever are cleaned and greased so the cords run smoothly. The bolts are checked to be sure the heads sit firm on the shafts, since a bolt head that parts company with its bolt at the wrong moment turns a fine weapon into an awkwardly shaped stick. Inside the armoury, everything waits in patient order. The helmets are set out in rows, the shields stacked and leaning, the spears and polearms standing upright in their racks, the swords and axes laid along the shelves. The room smells of oil and old leather, and someone is almost always in it, wiping down steel, because rust never rests, and neither can the man whose task it is to fight it. Nothing in that room may have been used in years. Everything in it is kept as though it might be needed before nightfall, and that quiet contradiction is really the whole philosophy of a castle gathered into a single room. And beyond the armoury door the ordinary morning goes on. The forge rings. The scribes write. while the great chamber above still held the grey of early morning, and the household lay quiet under blankets and cloaks. Someone below was already kneeling at the hearth, raking last night's embers out from under their soft covering of ash, and coaxing them back to life with slivers of dry. Somewhere below, in the great vaulted kitchen, the fires have already been built up, and the cooks are beginning the long, deliberate work of the day's principal meal, which is a matter of considerably more ceremony than breakfast ever was. The kitchen woke long before the hall did. Kindling. It was patient work, and it happened every day in every season, whether the Lord was in residence or away, whether there were 40 mouths to feed or 400. The fire was the first thing lit and the last thing banked, and in a very real sense the whole castle was arranged around it. In many castles the kitchen was not built into the main range at all. It stood a little apart, joined to the hall by a covered passage or a short walk across the courtyard, and the reason was simple and practical. Kitchens burned. Open fires, spitting fat, stacked firewood and roofs of thatch or timber made them the most hazardous rooms in the whole complex, and a lord who had spent a fortune on his stone walls did not care to lose them to a spark from his own supper. So the kitchen was often given thick walls of its own and a high roof of its own, sometimes with a great vent at the centre to draw the smoke upward. Anyone stepping inside on a working morning would have found a room built like a small church and used like a forge, with fireplaces broad enough to roast a whole animal, iron cranes swinging cauldrons over the coals, and a heat that pressed against the face from the doorway. The scale of it is hard to picture from a modern kitchen. A great household might roast several joints at once on long iron spits, each turned by hand by a boy sitting as close to the fire as he could bear, shielding his face with a wet cloth or a board. Cauldrons the size of barrels simmered with pottage. Bread ovens, built as domes of brick or stone, were heated by burning wood inside them until the walls glowed, then swept clean so the loaves could bake in the stored warmth. Nothing in that room was quick. Everything rested on judging heat by hand and eye, on knowing when an oven had cooled enough for pastry and when the coals were right for a delicate fish, on a kind of skill that lived in the fingers rather than in anything written down. And the kitchen was only one department among many. A large medieval household was divided into small specialized offices, each with its own keeper, its own store, and its own accounts. The pantry looked after the bread, and the man who ran it was called the pantler. The buttery, despite the name, had nothing to do with butter and everything to do with drink, and it was where the butler kept the ale and the wine and the cups. The larder held salted and preserved meat and fish. The saucery ground and mixed the sauces. The spicery guarded the pepper and ginger and cinnamon, precious enough to be kept under lock and key, and in the grandest households a chandlery made the candles that lit the whole enterprise. Above all of them sat the steward and the household clerks, tallying everything, because a castle that could not account for its stores could not be confident of surviving a winter. The food itself was more varied and more interesting than we sometimes assume. At the foundation of it lay pottage, a thick simmered dish of grains and pulses and whatever vegetables the season offered, cooked slowly and eaten by nearly everyone. Bread was constant, ranging from the fine white loaves of the high table to darker, denser bread made from mixed grains. Meat, for those entitled to it, came roasted, boiled or baked in a pastry case that served partly as a cooking vessel and was not always meant to be eaten. Fish mattered enormously, because the church calendar set aside many days of the year on which meat was not served, and a well-run estate kept its own ponds of carp and bream, and bought barrels of salted herring and dried cod besides. Onions, leeks, Cabbages, beans and peas did far more of the daily work than the feast menus suggest, since it was the ordinary dishes that kept a household standing. What surprises people most, perhaps, is the seasoning. Medieval cooking at the wealthy end was not bland at all. Sauces were bright and sharp, thickened with breadcrumbs or ground almonds rather than with flour and butter, sweetened and soured at the same time with vinegar, with verjuice pressed from unripe grapes, with honey and dried fruit. Ginger, saffron, cinnamon, cloves and grains of paradise travelled the same long roads we followed earlier, through the caravanserais and the ports, to arrive at last in a stone kitchen in a damp northern valley and be ground in a mortar by a cook who had never seen the country they came from. Colour mattered too. Dishes were tinted golden with saffron, green with parsley, red with sandalwood, because a table was meant to be looked at as much as tasted. At the top of the whole operation stood the master cook, and he was a figure of real authority. He hired and disciplined his undercooks, held the keys to certain stores, planned the day's meals around what the larder actually held and what the calendar allowed, and answered to the steward for every penny of it. Beneath him worked the roasters and the bakers and the sauce makers, and beneath them the scullions, who scrubbed the pots and hauled the water and swept the floors and were generally the youngest and the least paid people in the building. It was hot, tiring, unglamorous work, and it never entirely stopped, because as soon as one meal had gone out, preparation for the next began. Then came the journey from the kitchen to the hall, which was a small drama of its own. If the kitchen stood apart, the food had to cross open ground, and in an English winter that was no trifling matter. Dishes travelled covered, carried at speed by servants who knew that a cold sauce reflected badly on the whole household. There were households where a dish was tasted before it went up, partly as a courtesy and partly as a precaution, and where a marshal or an usher governed the order in which everything moved, since a great meal was served in courses and each course carried several dishes at once, set down together. Often the food paused in a serving room or a passage between the two, where it was arranged, checked and handed on, so that people could reach across for whatever they preferred. The hall itself was the heart of the castle in a way the private chambers never were. It was tall, often roofed with great curved timbers, its walls sometimes painted or hung with cloth, its floor strewn with rushes and sweet herbs that were swept out and replaced. Most of the tables were boards laid on trestles, which meant the room could be cleared and repurposed in minutes, and at the far end, raised on a low platform called the dais, stood the high table where the lord and lady sat with honoured guests. Behind them there might be a great embroidered hanging, and above them, in the later castles, a window designed to throw light across exactly that spot. The room was arranged so that the eye travelled naturally toward the people at the top of it. In the evening, the light came from beeswax candles at the high table and cheaper tallow further down, from rushlight soaked in fat and from the hearth itself, and it was a light quite unlike ours. It moved. It pulled warmly around faces and left the corners of the hall in soft darkness, so that a room full of people felt smaller and closer than it really was, and the painted patterns on the walls seemed to shift a little whenever a door opened and a draught crossed the flames. Where a person sat said a great deal about them. On the high table stood a large ornamental salt cellar, often a beautiful object in silver, and it worked as a quiet marker in the geography of the meal. To sit above the salt was to sit among the important. To sit below it was to sit further from the centre of things. Down the long side tables the household ranged itself in careful order, officers and gentlemen and clerks nearer the top, grooms and boys further down. People ate in small groups called messes, 2 or 3 or 4 sharing a dish between them, and often sharing a trencher as well, a thick slab of day-old bread that soaked up the juices and was collected afterwards. Spoons and knives were personal possessions, brought to the table. Forks for eating were still an unfamiliar southern novelty in much of Europe. Because so much was shared, table manners were taken seriously, and books of courtesy were written to teach young people how to behave, telling them not to lean on the table, not to speak with a full mouth, not to reach past a neighbour, and to keep their hands and their nails clean. Cleanliness was more than a suggestion. Before eating, water was poured over the hands of the seated guests from a jug into a basin held beneath, and a towel was offered, and this small ritual was performed by a servant of good standing because it counted as a mark of respect rather than a chore. A chaplain said grace. Only then did the meal properly begin. Serving at a great table was itself an honour rather than a humiliation. The sons of noble families were regularly sent to another lord's household to be brought up there, and part of that education was waiting at table, carving, mealing, to present a cup. Carving in particular was a genuine art, with its own vocabulary and its own written instructions, and a young man who could take apart a bird or a joint neatly in front of an audience had learned something worth knowing. He was not merely handing over food. He was showing that he had been raised properly, and the whole hall could see it. For the household, dinner in the middle of the day was the main event, with a lighter supper toward evening. On ordinary days the meal was substantial but unremarkable, and the room emptied quickly afterwards, because there was work waiting outside. It was the feast that everyone remembered. A wedding, a Christmas, a saint's day, the visit of a bishop or a neighbouring lord, all of these called for something extraordinary, and the accounts kept by household clerks show enormous quantities of provisions moving through the gates. Some records of the very greatest occasions give numbers so large that historians treat them with a certain caution, yet even a sceptical reading leaves us with feasts of astonishing scale. At such a meal there might be several courses, each ending with something sweet or spiced, and between the courses the great household sometimes presented a subtlety, a sculptured set-piece made from pastry or sugar or marzipan, and shaped into a castle, a ship, a beast, or a coat of arms. It was carried in to be admired, and it carried a message with it, about the family, about an alliance, about the occasion. At the end came spiced wine and thin crisp wafers, and then the tables were pushed aside, and the harpers and pipers and the fiddler came forward, and there was singing and dancing and dice and riddles and long circular stories that everyone had heard before and wanted to hear again. None of this was purely pleasure. A feast was politics conducted with food, inviting a rival's household, seating an abbot correctly, offering a visiting knight the cup before another, sending a particular dish down the hall to a particular man as a mark of favour. All of it was legible to the people in the room, and all of it was remembered afterwards. Hospitality was among the loudest statements a lord could make about his own standing, and a reputation for a generous table was worth a great deal in a world where loyalty was personal and had to be renewed face to face. Meanwhile the almoner moved quietly among the tables, gathering what was left, the soaked trenchers and the untouched portions, to be given at the gate to the poor of the district. That was both a genuine act of charity and an expected part of what a great house owed the world around it. And it should be said plainly, because it is easy to be dazzled by the silver, that not everyone in the shadow of the castle ate like that. The feast was the exception rather than the rule, even inside the walls, and beyond them the seasons still governed everything, as they had for the villagers we spent the first part of the evening with. A poor harvest reached the kitchen as surely as it reached the cottage, and there were lean winters in every generation. The picture is not one of endless abundance. It is one of careful, watchful management, of stores counted and rationed and stretched, broken a few times a year by days of real plenty that people talked about for years afterwards. When the feast was over, the hall changed character again. The trestles were taken down and stacked against the wall, the rushes were swept, the dogs settled by the hearth, and many of the household simply lay down where they had eaten, wrapped in their cloaks on benches and on the floor, because the hall was their bedroom as much as their dining room. The fire was banked with ash so that it would still be alive at dawn. Somewhere above, a watchman walked the wall, and the wind moved over the stone the way it had moved over the stone in the mountains and along the caravan road, indifferent and patient and old. So the night ends where it began, with ordinary people living inside a rhythm larger than themselves, the villager watching the sky for the right wheat to sow, the merchant counting his camels at an oasis and setting out again toward a city he had only ever heard described, the cook banking a fire that his grandfather's generation had banked before him in a hall that would still be standing long after everyone in it had been forgotten. Their world was not gentler than ours, and it was not simpler either. It was differently arranged. They carried burdens we have mostly set down, and they were spared burdens we have quietly taken up, and somewhere in that exchange there is no clean verdict at all, only two ways of being human, each with its own weight and its own consolations. What survives of them is small and warm and easily missed. A worn step, a ledger with an ink smudge, a recipe for a sauce that somebody once thought worth writing down. The track a caravan wore into the sand 1,000 years ago, still faintly visible from the air. They had no idea that anyone would ever be listening for them. But the fire in the kitchen went out and was relit 10,000 times, and the seasons came round, and the road went on, and the hall grew quiet, and the night settled over all of it, the way it settles now.